Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Today, I will be your host in this podcast episode titled Exploring Dramatic Stories and Authors. My name is Amaris, and today I am with two honorable guests, Miss Carissa and Miss Mutia. First, I would like to call Miss Carissa. Hello, Miss Carissa. Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Hello Maris, hello Mutia, and hello everyone. My name is Charissa, and I am going to tell you guys about Renaissance literature with my partner here, Mutia.
Hello everyone. Hello Carissa and Amaris. I'm Mutia. I'm here to accompany Carissa as another viewpoint.
Okay, well, hello, welcome. I am very honored for your participation in today's podcast. In today's podcast, we will be discussing about Renaissance literature. So, in this episode, we'll be covering so many topics regarding the Renaissance literature, starting from the background to its characters, and so much more to be revealed later on. And so, without further ado, on our first topic of today's Renaissance literature will be the historical context. Okay, so in today's first topic, we will be discussing about the historical context behind Renaissance literature. Of course, there are a lot of key events and what happened during in the Renaissance era, and I would like to ask for Miss Carissa about your explanation and what are your thoughts and what is the actual context behind the Renaissance literature during this era.
Okay, we know that the Renaissance period is in 14th to 17th centuries, right? And in this period of time, the transformative literature movement is the most transformative in the histories. So, after the fall of the Constantinople, the literary consents are increased between the people and the books more accessible. What about Mutia? What do you think in these historical key points that we can highlight more?
I think we could highlight about the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440. It can making books more accessible and fostering literacy.
Yeah, I agree because after that invention, we know that the spreading of books is around the world, even in the Western sides of uh, topics. We know that European culture are very transformed in this era.
Yeah, I think it's the same as the TikTok did for dance trends. Suddenly everyone was know about it. It's make a trend.
Okay, well, thank you for your interesting take. So, if I can assume that the historical context behind the Renaissance era was that it is such a transformable event that basically affects everything that is going on in this era, especially books and trends and everything like that, which is super amazing, let me tell you. Okay, well, I think that's enough for in the first topic of the historical context. So we will be moving further on to much more topics that we will be discussing later into our second topic, which is the genre. Okay, so our next topic in line, we will be discussing about genre in Renaissance literature. Okay, for this topic, there will be a lot of uncovering from arts and poetry and a lot more to be discussed. And I would like to ask Miss Mutia to explain about her take and all of its context behind this topic. Time is yours.
So the first genre was uh, tragedies and comedies. There are two counter genres. While tragedies is dramatic works about human flaws, faith, and emotional narrative. Meanwhile, comedies play that provide entertainment while subtly criticizing society. What about Carissa? What do you think?
Okay, talking about trauma and tragedies, we who doesn't know the mega creation of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, right? It is about love story, but in a tragical way. This is what a genre of tragedies and drama look like. About love, a big appreciation of emotion and feelings. Besides, we can also look into the genre in poetries. In poetries, there is sonnets and epic poetries, where sonnets is more like a philosophical context ideas, but the epic poetry is more into Renaissance intellectuals and artistic experiments. We can see the epic poetry such as the Odyssey by Homer, where it tells the stories of Odyssey in such a philosophical ways possible, and it is also shown how the developments of the characters are, and so on and so on and so on. I think that is genre pretty much seems to me in this Renaissance literatures are. So it's more like an intrigue in the audience, more impact in emotions rather than the medieval where it's more religious aspect we conceived from the literature elements.
Okay, well, thank you for our two guests speaking on the topic of genre. So, from this topic specifically, Renaissance literature made a historical turn of events by creating poetry as well as drama, right? In drama, it covers mostly tragedies and comedies, while poetry there are sonnets and epics. Okay, so this is very much still very impactful in today's era mostly, right? So I can tell that from the Renaissance era it has produced so many impactful objects and a lot of culture that has been embedded into our generation as well. Thank you. Okay, so we have another topic to uncover. The next one is characteristics covering in humanism and realism. Okay, now onto the next topic. We will be discussing about the characteristic of the Renaissance literature. So in today's episode, we will be uncovering in humanism and the realism of the Renaissance literature. Okay, so first I would maybe like to ask Miss Carissa to explain about your ideas and what are your take about the term said in the characteristics of the Renaissance literature. Time is yours.
Okay, so basically in the Renaissance literature, the characteristic is very well developed, where the authors who wrote the story is more depending on the wider perspective, such as humanism, in depth on emotional intelligence, and so on. Which in realism itself, it's very different from the medieval, where they are take an action where people is a subject by the god's faith or the god's um, way to portray people is not a human being who have their own thoughts. So it's basically a very well developed era where the characters' development in the story is very well highlighted. And I also think that it is very a good explanation where the realism in here can explore more about human interest and human characteristics such as love, um, and ambitions and so on. What do you think, Mutia?
Yeah, I agree with Carissa. Medieval literature gave us like saints and sinners, God, like that, while realism is more realistic. It's what happens in every everyday life, moving from purely religious and mythical to in some like kind of modern ones.
Yeah, I do agree with you. And if we see the characteristic of humanism and realism in here, we can also revert to Shakespeare's Hamlet, where the main characters questioning the existence of himself through storytelling rather than asking God what he is, and so on and so on and so on.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And this topic specifically, talking about characteristic in humanism and realism, it definitely takes on a big role in impacting the literature world that we have currently in today's. And I can say that it is a very interesting concept that they built. So it is very delightful to hear about talking about the characteristic of a human being and the realistic concept that they have to go through. Okay, well, next we have another topic to discuss, which is the influence. Okay, on our next topic, we will be uncovering the influence of the Renaissance literature in today's era. Okay, so there's about two subtopics to uncover. There is the impact on modern literature and the legacy in education itself. Okay, maybe I would like to ask Miss Mutia about your take and your ideas about this current concept. What do you think about the influence from the Renaissance literature in today's era or last?
So, the Renaissance literature impact on modern literature is like for forms, narrative structure, character development, and thematic complex complexity. And for the education is the study of classical texts become part of education, influencing critical thinking and literary analysis for centuries. What about Carissa?
Yeah, I more see it like the influence like this. The complexity of modern literature is came from what the Renaissance have built, right? I mean, it's in a good way where we can now explore more perspective through literature, where we can add like more emotional balance than just um, tales or something like that. That more realistics, and I think that the modern literature built by the Renaissance literature now is more delicacy and humanism when it comes to educational, because now the literature also become the educational curriculum, as we are the English literature students, right? That is the example of what the influence of Renaissance literature has become in these eras. So yeah, it's pretty much really build up our knowledge, and it's the pioneer of what we've known about life, about exploration and so on. So it's very good example, I can say.
Okay, well, thank you once again. Okay, from this topic, I can assume that the influence context itself has made a big impact to today's way of literature, especially in education, as well as other types of literature there is in this world. And all I can say is I'm also very amazed in this context of the influence from such a long time ago can have such impact in today's world, which is I am so amazed by it. Okay, well, enough about influence. We have another topic to uncover, which is the comparison with medieval literature. Okay, next topic in line, we'll be discussing about the comparison of the Renaissance literature with the medieval literature. As said earlier by Carissa and Mutia, there's a big difference in especially covering themes where Renaissance literature covers a lot more human arts, a lot more social matters, and whereas medieval it covers more into religious and moral themes. And maybe in this topic I would like to ask Miss Carissa, what is your take on this topic and what comparison, which points are needed to be said in this podcast, and time is yours.
Okay, of course, when we compare the Renaissance and medieval literature, the first one comes in mind is the big themes difference. We have mentioned it also a couple of times before, but we need to know also that in terms of language perspective, it is a little bit different where the Renaissance literature using more contemporary language where it's more accessible to the wider audience. For example, it's using more easy words to understand for the audience or the readers around the world when where they are not specifically learn the language before, so it is easier for the Renaissance literature to be translated to other language. So I think that was the biggest two difference there, but I don't really know a lot more. What about you, Mutya? Maybe you can add something more.
Yeah, aside from that, another big difference is in themes, as we know that Renaissance literature more focused on explored human flaws, emotion, and social critique, while like medieval literature is more like religious and it's I think it's so different in themes.
Well, okay, thank you again. From the comparison with medieval literature and Renaissance literature, as said earlier, there is two big differences, whereas it covers the differences in themes and its differences in the evolution of language. Well, I must say that they have their own purposes in each of their literature, which medieval are more into religious matters, and moreover in the Renaissance literature it covers more social and more artistic matters. I'm really interested. Okay, well, moving on, today on our last topic we will be discussing about the major authors of the Renaissance era in literature. All right, on our last topic of today's podcast episode, we will be discussing about the major authors in the Renaissance literature. Okay, there are three authors that are mainly pointed in this podcast. And first, in this topic, I would maybe like to ask Miss Mutia, maybe what are your takes in the overall concept of the authors and what have they wrote in the Renaissance era that has major impact on the literature in this world right now. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Amaris. So, the author that really famous that we all know is William Shakespeare. He's the master of human nature. And before Shakespeare, there's Dante and Geoffrey Chaucer. And Shakespeare took what Dante and Chaucer start and made it even better. So his shows all the messy part of being human, like some kind of his story, his food that popular, and I think even though he used old stories sometimes, he made them feel new by focusing on how real people think and feel.
Yeah, and I really got that. I mean, talking about Shakespeare's, right? He really embarks a new perspective of characters, we can say, in the Hamlet, for example, where he explore the keen and intelligent persons to what the existence of himself. So I really recommend you guys to watch that because it's very uh, emotional sides, we can say. And let's talk about the Dante Alighieri. I really look him as the masters of Renaissance literature because he is like the masters of epic poem. We can know about his works before Divine Comedy because he tells us exploring the journey towards God, which is blending the ideas of medieval and Renaissance literature. So it was very great.
Yeah, so Dante's popular work, The Divine Comedy, is, as Carissa said, about traveling through hell, purgatory, and heaven, and he did something new, like he made it personal. So Dante showed that you could write about your own life and feelings. So the next we will talk about Geoffrey Chaucer. So about 15 years after Dante, Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. Instead of writing about saints or kings, he wrote funny, sometimes rude story about regular people. A loud wife, a cheating salesman, a drunk cook, all traveling together. He wrote in English so normal people could enjoy it too. And this was the beginning of stories focused on everyday life rather than just religion.
Yeah, I really agree. I see the Canterbury Tales is very well illustrating a wide spectrum of medieval society. So it is very great to see how illustrated Renaissance author also illustrated the medieval eras that time. So yeah, it's really good stories. I recommend you guys to read also.
Okay, well, thank you once again for you two, and thank you, Carissa, for the book recommendations. Okay, there's absolutely no need for further explanation about this three historical authors. They are very widely known, even known as one of the legends of literature in this era, which I am very amazed at. Thank you for explanation, and I am very sorry to break it to you guys, but today's podcast episode will be ending shortly, and I would like to thank our two honorable guests and one of our video producer, Christina. Thank you for your participation as well. And I will end in today's podcast with a little bit of a quote taken from Hansel. You can, yes, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking make it so. From Hamlet, Act 2 and Scene 2. Okay, I, as your host, Amaris today, are gladly grateful and thankful to all of you who stayed until the end from this podcast. Thank you and good night.